Hello, my name's Anne Luke, and I'm here to present my paper In the Shadow of the 60s, Youth Activism and the 1978 11th Festival of Youth and Students in Havana. So methodologically, this paper is a form of microhistory or even a microhistory within a microhistory. The 11th Festival was an event forgotten even in traditional political accounts of the Cuban Revolution. So digging into this event is already a microhistorical task. But my way of reading the variety of sources was not with an aim to add to the broader political questions about which much has been written in terms of the Cuban Revolution. Indeed, it would probably have been easy to map the future political trajectories of some of the better known participants at the 11th Festival and make easy correlations. But rather, I wanted to look at the microhistory within this microhistory. In other words, look at the everyday experiences of participants of the festival, because as I was attracted by the advantages of microhistory being, in the words of Robert Hugh, that microhistory recognizes that, quote, many of us experience the global through personal networks or small scale interactions. And is, quote, more acutely, microhistory is more acutely aware of the fragmented and local nature of human experience. So that was what I wanted to do. And this has led me to the questions that this paper seeks to address. To what extent was the Cuban construction of revolutionary youth one of the exports of the 1978 festival? What was it like for young activists of other countries of the South and from the capitalist world and the socialist world, indeed, to visit a country where young people were at the centre rather perhaps than the periphery of discourse and policy and practice? By exploring micro moments rather than the more dramatic moments in these accounts, I wanted to, in these accounts and memoirs of the foreign participants, I wanted to explore what of Cuban culture and the Cuban culture of youth particularly is visible. I question how and how much do social constructions and discourses travel, taking the focus away from language and towards the textures of every day. How much can exchanges of young people in person foster hybrid cultures, and how can those hybrid cultures exist and or develop when they're created in a historical moment to wigs and then become dispersed? And I'm going to readdress that point towards the end. The shadow of the 60s, much has been said about youth in the 60s and particularly about Cuba in the 60s and about Cuban youth in the 60s. And you can see things like the Union of Young Communists, which you can see on the left was established in the young 60s, part of the young people being put at the center of life. And of course, the martyrdom of Che Guevara, who then actually was added, the figurehead of Che Guevara was added to the logo of the Union of Young Communists after his death in the late 60s. So after the successful rebellion of the 1950s and the start of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, much of the 1960s was spent consolidating the base on which to define and construct the Cuban Revolution. And from the very early days, youth were at the center of this project. Young activists of the Cuban 60s in Cuba were not the countercultural activists of North America and Western Europe. And although they shared certain causes, and indeed there was a lot of quite considerable interaction, particularly between student activists and the New Left. Sorry, I think it froze on me. Okay, it saw young people as important actors in the construction of the revolution. There was no need to demonstrate in the streets, as young people were already at the forefront of revolutionary development, both in the political sphere, although this was complex and contested with the increasing importance of the young communists, and also in the cultural sphere with young poets, artists, singers, and intellectuals occupying a cultural vanguard, challenging the very meaning of what it meant to be Cuban, to be revolutionary, and to be young. So not that this was without problems, but by and large, the thousands of young people from outside Cuba who visited in 1978 would witness a youth substantially more empowered than was the case in many other countries. There was also in Cuba a national myth which put great onus on the heroic role of young people. So very briefly, I want to give you a bit of a context of the 1978 Youth Festival. In Cuba, every year is given a name. So the year of the literacy campaign, the year of the of emulation, socialist emulation. Now, 1978 was named the year of the 11th Festival. A whole year given over to 2 weeks, one summer, when youth from across the world would gather in Havana. This was a culmination of mid to late 1970s renewed focus on youth, and the festival was used actually to launch the Cuban Code on Childhood and Youth, which was an early statement on children's rights, and also to rename the small island of Cuba, the Isle of Pines, the Isle of Youth, some 11 years after promising this would happen. A quick word on the history of these international youth festivals. These were launched in 1945 by the World Federation of Democratic Youth. The 11th festival was the first festival held outside Europe and the very first to be held in the developing world. The 11th festival was 2 weeks. It was held from the 28th of July to the 5th of August in 1978, and its languages were Spanish, English, French, and Russian. The culture of the festival wasn't like its predecessors. They were generally known as sort of socialist festivals, very sort of militarized, politicized and militarized. Whereas the culture of the festival was nothing like its predecessors. Despite the fact that the festival incorporated many political activities, such as putting imperialism on trial, the central focus was social and cultural. Soft politics took precedence, as the dulcet tones of this festival song will show you. There was a festival hymn, but I think which was the kind of much more military, had a much more military tones. You can, if you hear the tones of the song, you can much more get a sense of the spirit or the sounds of the festival. And you can see from this quote from the author of the lyrics of the song that actually the lyrics almost represent a love song, but it's supposed to be, it could be a love song between a boyfriend and girlfriend or friends, but actually it's supposed to represent the love of between Cuban young people and people from around the world. So we'll listen just to a few seconds of this. No, oh, we won't. Oh, try again. So the delegations who came to the festival came from both the came from the capitalist world, the communist world, and the developing world. One US delegate at the time noted to a journalist that they preferred not to think of the festival movement as being communist or even socialist, but the movement is properly characterized, she noted, as being anti-imperialist. But it's fair to say that many of the delegations, particularly those from the developing world and from Western Europe indeed, were comprised people from the young communist or young socialist groups in those countries. In total, there were over 20,000 young people from over 140 delegations that went to Cuba, and some accounts took over 140 delegations, some of over 160. The ages of these young people, the youngest I've heard of was 16. Some of the delegations, some young people complained that there were people in the delegations that were definitely outside the boundaries of what could be considered young, but by and large, the majority, I think, were young. For the purposes of this paper, I have only very few sources, or only one indeed, from the socialist world. This is because of linguistic issues on my part. So I've accessed sources only in English, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese. So these are the countries in which I've got accounts, either memoirs, accounts straight after the time, or memoirs, oral history more recently. The first thing really is to think about the delegates. Why were they there? And it's for a multitude of reasons. But I think one thing that comes through in the accounts is that they weren't really there to talk about anti-imperialism. There was a deep curiosity amongst these young left-wing groups from both the capitalist and the developing world about the revolution in Cuba, more so than there was, as I say, in the purposes of the festival. One Spanish delegate noted, indeed, those of us who arrived in Cuba had more interest in seeing the revolutionary homeland of Che and Fidel than to participate in the festival. And rather anecdotally, for I haven't drawn the evidence together here, issues such as the beach or interactions between social interactions feature much more in the accounts I've heard than the conference hall. The importance of Cuba to its hemisphere is also in evidence. Indeed, a UK delegate comments, quote, "The thing I hadn't realized really was how significant Cuba was for everybody else in Latin America. Like the passion, the Chileans or the Venezuelans or wherever it was. That was the thing. They were so much more gung-ho about Cuba than the Cubans were even then." A delegate from St. Lucia spoke of his reverence for some of the most important revolutionary material. Quote, "There was no toilet paper of the type we were accustomed to, so we had to wipe with sheets of grandma newspaper and throw the dirty paper in a basket. But I just couldn't do that, not with the highly revered grandma." And the same delegate had talked about in the early years of their youth, getting the weekly English language grammar delivered to St. Lucia, and it being an important moment of his week. That's the Communist Party newspaper. So now on to the kind of what I've found in the evidence I've collected so far. Before I kind of talk to the kind of things that emerge in terms of how they relate to the social construction of youth, of the Cuban social construction of youth, I wanted to make the point that the accounts are not all kind of rosy or all positive. And in fact, I think what comes through is that it wasn't an entirely, it was a life-changing and amazing experience, but wasn't necessarily easy. So there were moments of difficulty, moments of unsureness there. And for many delegates, of course, it was the first time these young people had left their homelands and left their countries. First time they'd been on a plane, perhaps, or sailed across an ocean to another country. So I think, and indeed, for example, the St. Lucian delegate who shared with delegates from El Salvador, Nicaragua, and found their camera was missing. So I think I don't want to put the atmosphere across. It was only sunshine, but I think if we look at the kind of evidence that comes through again and again, what I wanted to put across is the side of it that aligns with the social construction of youth and childhood in Cuba, but not an entirely rosy picture. So the first theme, or the first thing that comes through in multiple accounts really, is this theme of kind of warmth and feeling special, and it's to do with how young people were put at the center, the centrality of young people. So right from the arrival of delegations, an elaborate welcome was given to them. So from the UK delegate said to me, they were asked to leave the plane before the other passengers, the 15 members of the delegation who were they arrived on the runway in Havana. And she says, we didn't know what was happening. And down at the bottom of the steps were all these photographers. They were all Cuban press and so on. And later on, when they were given gifts, were given a bag of gifts, they said, the delegate said, it was really quite overwhelming to be treated like that. The Dominican delegate arriving from Cienfuegos by sea said, one of the Dominican delegates said, quote, a table full of food. That says, quote, "That table was sagging under a cornucopia of tropical fruits such as oranges, guavas, pineapples, apricots, grapefruits, plums, and other fruit I couldn't recognize. It's one of those occasions you look at a variety of foods arrayed, and that horn of plenty turns one stupid." So, but that sense of being special went beyond the welcome. It infused the atmosphere of the festival. Whilst on the one hand, journalistic accounts and some personal perhaps talked to the fiesta side of the festival, the kind of party side. The New York Times headline stated, "Politics aside, Cuba is festive for visiting young leftists." And on the other hand, two of the personal accounts I accessed talk of the development of personal relationships at the festival. In between these, perhaps, is a more collective warmth experienced by delegates. In the almost entirely political South African account in the ANC's magazine, they talk about, quote, "the warmth and truly internationalist spirit of the Cuban people that was a source of inspiration and strength to each one of us." An Indian delegate speaks about the the exceptional experience in terms of the scale, the warmth and generosity of its host. A traveller, not quite a delegate, a traveller from the Czech Republic speaks of the warmth. The UK delegate, and the Dominican delegate equally spoke about the Cuban students, workers, bus drivers, policemen, militia lavished love and attention on us to the degree that there were tears on both sides when we left Fidel Lenin. So this was perhaps, as Damian Fernandez talks about the politics, when talking about Cuban politics, the politics of passion in action. And I think if we want to see the kind of warmth that comes coming through in the kind of micro political or micro interactions, I thought that this this anecdote that you can see of the Olympic swimming pool is quite a nice one that shows us how that the safety of the applause from the group of Cubans who applaud the Dominican delegate for having the courage to jump off the Olympic diving pool that he'd never seen before, and he feels safe at the end of that, was a nice sort of anecdote to illustrate that kind of sense of warmth and safety felt by the delegates who were there. Right, the second sort of feeling of being important, so the warmth and the welcome and being important, but even more important, and this sort of recurring story comes in 3 accounts, but all memoirs, is the arrival of the Jeep. And in the Jeep arrives Fidel. And as I say, 3 accounts very similar, but only this one that you see on the screen of a delegate who actually met Fidel as he left the Jeep. Now, it is quite possible. The delegates were housed in a very large school premises, several large school premises, but it's quite possible that that hundreds of delegates at a time would have seen Fidel leaving his Jeep and waving to the delegates. And this would be a memorable moment. So the Indian delegate, the Dominican one, and the UK delegate all remember seeing Fidel leave his Jeep, and the kind of more the more pushy people trying to get forward and trying to shake his hands, etc. But the Dominican delegate happened to be outside at that stage, so was able to shake hands and kiss Fidel on the cheek and hug Fidel. Very emotive moment for this delegate. So again, that the feeling of being so important that Fidel would come and see, was there, and was there constantly. So was there, and of course culminating in the speech on in the Plaza de la Revolución, big rally. So the final kind of, but really important and recurring theme, which I was maybe a little bit surprised to find recurring, was the theme of children. And I think here what we're seeing is quite an overlap, again, which I was quite surprised to see, between the kind of the absorption, if you like, of the Cuban construction of childhood and the Cuban construction of youth and its relation to childhood. One memory which recurs both in the accounts directly after the festival and in the memoirs, and is this was from an interview with a UK delegate, is the moment when some of the rebel or the soldiers in the rebel army, which is then the Ejército Rebelde, the standing army of Cuba, come into the stadium at the opening ceremony carrying a child in white clothes, and then who then does dances and gymnastics. So so several people spoke about that as moving and as remembering that. And again, all the delegates were at that opening festival. So, but that particular memory is for a very long opening ceremony. That's a memory that's particularly that particularly comes to mind. But I think it's those everyday encounters again with children, which I think again recur in accounts, and I think really which I think are really interesting. So the Portuguese delegation who are asked to sign the Cuban pioneers books, and they say Portugal and oh, it's the land of Vasco da Gama, and the UK delegate who tells me that an older man comes to see her and says, my daughter was at the opening ceremony and has been practicing for weeks, or the Dominican delegate who met a Cuban boy on the beach, offered him a sandwich and he didn't accept it, and then regretted not accepting that sandwich from that young little revolutionary. So what kind of conclusions do I have from in relation to sort of the Cuban social construction of youth? So first of all, what comes across that is kind of absorbed is that centrality of youth, that importance of youth, the kind of construction of young people as heroes, as valued in their own right. That's certainly very much there, rather than being peripheral or countercultural, very much at the centre, valued enough that Fidel would play a strong role, valued enough to be welcomed, valued enough to be loved, and to be given that kind of warmth by a whole country of people, and to have a very, very high status. The focus on childhood is interesting, and I think we see there was a very strong link. There's a very strong link between the construction of youth and childhood in Cuba, but they are quite different. And I think certainly the kind of warmth and the friendship and love is close to the Cuban construction of childhood. And it struck me, I know from other work I've carried out, that there was significant mobilization for the festival. So Cuban children were prepared to meet their foreign visitors, and they were told to be, and I quote, the Cuban children were told to be polite, considerate, of happy disposition, but not too effusive or scatty, and friendly, of course, but not over familiar. Now that, to me, that kind of instruction doesn't speak to me of the experience that these that the delegates felt, the love and the warmth that they felt. So I don't think you can mobilize for that warmth and love that was felt by the delegates, and yet it is something to do with the experiences of meeting these the children, seeing and meeting the children in Cuba. So I think that overlap between the construction of childhood and construction of youth was a very important kind of, in terms of what these young activists took away from the festival. So in previous work, so as a last sort of tentative conclusion, in previous work I've looked at the effect of how some filtering in of different cultures into Cuba has created a sort of hybridization of cultures on the island. But I'm interested in what this particular microhistorical study tells us in the other direction. It's more dispersed, clearly, 20,000 young people of 140 plus delegations. And I think theoretically, hybridization doesn't work to understand the cultural impact here. However, I think there are these parallels in disparate accounts across time and across the globe in the South and North, perhaps give us an early indication of new forms of subjectivities. I'm yet fully to develop these last conclusions, though I hope to develop them further by the date of the conference. For these young, I think that for these young activists, home no longer had the centrality it had. Perhaps it had, and leaving Cuba was, to quote the UK delegate, devastating, whilst the experience of Cuba was life-changing. The Indian delegate says, I discovered Africa at that event. My initial theoretical conclusion leads me to feel that this micro-history may indicate what we can see through the returning delegates might be the beginning of the formation of the nomadic subject, of which Rosie Braidotti talks, or perhaps even a slightly fractured subject, a subject no longer centered on place, but partially determined or displaced by the material, emotional, and everyday experience of being in a young revolution in the making. And on this, I would warmly welcome any comments. Many thanks for listening. That's me. Thank you, and thank you very much. And I look forward to discussions.